This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. We will also explore threats to meaningful engagement in sport and movement culture practices and ask questions about what we can learn about the human condition through our involvement in sport. The guests are leading scholars in human and social sciences of sport who share their explorations in a scholarly as well as a personal context. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. This is the second part of our discussion on sport coaching and care with Dr. Colum Cronin. In the first part, which I recommend you to check out, we explored Colum's phenomenological work on what it means to be a sport coach. Care was one of the essences he identified in that work. In research that followed, he has developed the notion of care in sport coaching and moved from a phenomenological to a more feminist sociological perspective on care. Today, we explore these ideas and discuss how care fits into the picture of coaching in elite sport context, which is known to be result-oriented and a tough world not only for athletes but also for coaches. Dr. Colum Cronin is a senior lecturer in sport coaching and physical education at Liverpool John Moores University and serves as an associate editor for Sport Coaching Review. His research has explored what it means to be a coach and has recently focused on understanding how coaches can develop caring relationships with athletes. In his work, he often uses phenomenological and narrative research approaches and qualitative methodologies. I hope you enjoy today's discussion. I think this is the point that we will move to caring, but what you said about caring for the athlete, like beyond the season, that's one of the things that often comes when you look at studies on athletic retirement and what former athletes find. One of the very difficult things for them is that the relationship with the coach ends completely and the coach doesn't seem to be interested in them anymore when they are not athletes. So the coach is not calling, not making a contact, not asking how you are doing. And that leaves the athlete with the sense of kind of the relationship was just fully conditional on them being athletes. And that's difficult for a lot of athletes when they stop.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So just before I get into that then, I think it's important to remember, so at this point in my research, I was coming at this with, some interest in kind of phenomenological philosophy. So as I said, my care was this idea of kind of concern, interest initially. This idea that part of being a human is a concern, otherwise why would you get out of bed? You might do it for self-interest, or you might do it for an interest in your family or your work, but, part of being human is concern. So that there's very few carefree individuals who are genuinely carefree, if that makes sense, So these coaches weren't carefree. They were interested in their sports. They were interested in athletes. They were interested in performance at this point. And before we move on to then delving into caring relationships, I think it's important to say that, I think that phenomenological philosophy probably still has a lot to offer, that I haven't really followed up on. So I probably need to do more work around kind of, educational philosophy, for instance, or the relationships and temporality and care from a philosophical sense. But I kind of parked the phenomenological philosophy at this stage, and I need to come back to it. And the reason why I did that was because it kind of answered the question. It's not that these coaches are not caring. They do care. As I said, otherwise, why would you go out on a Tuesday night? The more interesting question becomes, what are they caring about and how are they caring? And that took me away from phenomenology then, and it took me into kind of care literature. So my more recent work hasn't used as much phenomenology. It's actually used more care theory from feminist sociology, Nell Nodding's work in particular, who is a philosopher as well, but is very much a care specialist, and that's kind of where I've gone down then, is to move from caring and conceived as an interest to caring as a relationship between two people. I don't know if that last little bit has been confusing or if I've helped to kind of distinguish a shift in my research then.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. So would you still say that being in the coaching world paper is kind of the foundation for your care research? That's something that you've done a lot in the recent years, but that was in the second sense of the word of care, just like you now explained. So moving away from care as concern in the Heideggerian sense to more towards caring for another person.
You summed it up brilliantly, Nora. Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, that's it. The paper is a starting point. It's the foundation. And then in my subsequent research, I'm kind of drilling into each of the essences. And in my care work, which I've probably done the most on so far, I've turned to Nodding's work. Now, listeners might not be up to date with Nodding, so should I give a brief introduction there?
That would be very helpful, yeah.
Yeah, so Nodding's comes at care as a pedagogical relationship. And her early work was very much focused on kind of, typical care between a mother and a child. With three kind of main elements here, which is the idea that a mother is engrossed in the child's needs, so providing sustained attention. And that's something I saw in the coaches and other people have seen in coaches as well, where coaches invest time observing, listening to athletes. So they're providing not just attention as a one-off, but sustained attention. Second, Nodding's concept was motivational displacement. Sometimes the mother will put their needs apart and serve the needs of the athlete, serve the needs of the child. And again, coaches, we say the same thing. Coaches might want to stay at home on a Tuesday night, but they go out and it's raining and it's cold and they put on a session. And they might not want to look at the diaries, but they do to serve the needs of the athlete. An interesting point there is that those needs aren't always separate. So athletes want to improve as well, and coaches want to win as well. So sometimes these needs actually converge. It's not always putting one person's needs to the side to serve the other. Sometimes we've got joint needs, And the third element of Nodding's work is really important to clarify that it's a caring relationship, because a third concept that Nodding introduces is reciprocity, which is the idea that even a young child provides something to that relationship. It might be a smile, it might be a cry, it might be a hug, it might be playing and engagement. And for a relationship to be caring, the carer also has to contribute. And that might be accepting care, it might be accepting advice, it might be listening, it might be contributing. But without that, a caring relationship is in danger of becoming a dominating relationship, where the carer makes decisions for the cared for, imposes their will. So it has to be an element of autonomy on both sides as well here. It has to be an interdependent relationship. So that's kind of Nodding's early work. And since then, that work has been applied in social care, in nursing, in education, looking to develop caring classrooms, for example. where teachers are engrossed in the needs of their pupils. They serve those needs, but pupils also reciprocate and contribute to a caring relationship. Similar in nursing, between nurses and their patients, sustained attention, interest, motivational displacement. And I think we're starting to see that some coaches have caring relationships in sport like that. Yeah, and that brings us kind of up to date. Yeah.
Yeah. I think my next question was going to be that when you talked about using this framework or the kind of theoretical approach to understanding different contexts, like the classroom, for example, what are your reflections so far? Can you apply that in a sports coaching context, or are there some kind of problems or something you need to adjust in your thinking?
Yeah, so we now have a series of case studies where researchers have examined and spoken to coaches to understand how they go about this practice. And coaches will often share practices consistent with noddings. You know, I pay attention, I serve the athlete's needs, the athletes contribute back. It's a coaching athlete family environment almost. So, you know, we've got good case studies from the coach's perspective. Couple of things really on that. One is that we haven't got much research from the athlete perspective of being cared for, which is ironic given Nodding's emphasis that actually the athlete voice or the cared for voice is really important. Now, fortunately, Sports Coaching Review, a journal I'm an associate editor on, has a special issue, and some of that work will be coming out over the next few months, hopefully. So that will move us on a little. And the other thing is that because we've mainly done these case studies by listening to coaches, that we also have to treat those views critically. And we've started to see some critical problems that maybe need further exploring. Have we got time to go through 2 or 3 of them?
I think we have the time. So yeah,
great,
that would
no
be
problem.
Great.
So, you know, there's a recent paper, John Dalston et al., talked about how sustainable is a caring relationship. And I think that's really interesting for 2 points. Caring is a form of labor. It's a form of emotional labor. It's demanding. It's draining. This takes us back to your point about if we put too much caring labor on coaches, is it sustainable? Are we going to burn out coaches? And is it sustainable for the athlete? Does the athlete actually need to develop independence away from this caring relationship in time? And I don't have the answers to these problems, but it was posed by John and colleagues, and I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, and I think when we are kind of starting to explore this, it's still fairly unexplored. So I think just kind of throwing these questions out there is the first critical step to start developing our understanding in this area.
Absolutely. There's a few years work in this, definitely. You know, and hopefully colleagues will pick up the baton and research this area, you know, and explore it. And one of the things I think that also needs to be explored is the gendered form of care. So care is often gendered in terms of it's associated as a feminine activity. And so if we think in terms of, you know, in the UK, the caring profession is nursing, which is predominantly conducted by females, though not exclusively. Whereas we kind of tend to think of doctors as more logical, scientific, and maybe more aloof, less caring, more objective. And that gendered form of care doesn't just happen in medicine. It might happen in primary school education, predominantly performed by females again, versus university professors, which are predominantly male. And often that gendered work is often undervalued and less rewarded. Nurses paid less than doctors, primary school educators paid less than university professors. You know, care in the home is predominantly performed by female, and again, possibly undervalued. And I wonder if we see the same thing in sport. Is care outsourced to the physiotherapist? Is it outsourced to the sports psych? is it actually seen as a weakness at times? Do you have to be cutthroat and aggressive and assertive to be a high performance coach? And those caring coaches might be sent down to coach children rather than athletes. And we know that high performance athletes need care. We know that because of the amount of, media coverage of abusive scandals. But are we employing and valuing caring labour in those high performance contexts, or do we see it as a gendered, undervalued form of labour? So again, there's a massive area to research there, and I haven't got the answers on that. I'd be interested if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, at least what you see in the discussions about what is the professional role of a sports psychologist, I think this caring element is something that comes through more and more in the recent years, that kind of sports psychologist might be the person who doesn't care about whether the athlete is performing or not. So that's the person who is there for the athlete as a person first and the athlete second. So that would be unconditional acceptance and the interest in the athlete as a person. That would be the remit of the sports psychologist in certain cases.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there are debates about that as well. What is the sports psychologist role? Is it performance enhancement or caring, or is it both?
Yeah.
I think most would say that it's both. Yeah.
And I would say the same thing about the coach, because one of the misconceptions around care is we move away from Nodding's idea of a pedagogical relationship. So the reason why caring becomes pedagogical is because if the coach is engrossed in the athlete, then they understand their needs. They know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, they know what they're struggling with. And if the coach is serving those needs, then they put on sessions to help them. And if they're doing that in a reciprocal relationship, they're doing it collaboratively, where the athlete is also contributing. So caring isn't just a nice thing to do from a duty of care point of view. It's also actually good education, and education is an essence of coaching. So if we go back to that being in the World Paper, caring isn't just the moral thing to do. It's also a performance enhancing thing to do. And that's why I think it's important that the coaches do both, because actually the caring relationship leads to the enhancement of performance. That's why I worry about outsourcing care to athlete welfare officers or sports psych, because then I worry that coaches don't provide athletes with sustained attention, don't consider their needs and what they're going through and how they can support them. And if they do that, then actually we'll end up with bad coaching.
Yeah, then we have a specialist for every single thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in the Finnish Olympic team, for example, they have a sports pastor. They didn't have a sports psychologist for a long time, but they had this pastor who is there to talk to athletes and listen to them.
Yeah.
And in the UK, in football, you have the sport chaplains as well. And they are kind of working with athletes of all religions and beliefs. So,
and it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wonder, you think again, who is best placed to notice the athlete? Is it the coach who's on the bus with them, in the hotel with them, on the field with them, in the changing room? Or is it the sport pastor who might come in once a week? Surely both have actually got a role here,
Surely both, yeah.
We go back to that noticing, providing attention, empathizing. Actually, the coach is well positioned to do a lot of that work. They might need to be resourced and skilled to do that. And, maybe there's a key educational role for sports psychs and athlete welfare officers there to work with the coaching team around that. So yeah, it's a complex area. We need more research, and we probably need more action research situated in context to explore this really. So that's one of the areas we need to explore. So we've talked about the gendered element. We talked about role specialization. We talked about sustainability. The other one, of course, is kind of care. How do we teach coaches to care in both a safeguarding sense, but also in a developing relationships sense? So yes, we absolutely need to do safeguarding, and we don't want athletes to come to harm. How do we move beyond that minimum standard of non-malevolence to actually benefits, so that actually, okay, how do we develop those caring relationships? Again, we could do with action research, we could do with intervention research to develop that. We've got, an area there to explore on interventions. And then the other one, which brings us back to a recent paper we did, which is, what about the wider climate? So how do you develop caring relationships when everybody's job depends on winning, when the media can provide pressure and coaches can be sacked and replaced very quickly, and short-termism? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on either of them.
Yeah, I think we will move on to talking about this ruthless and brutal nature of elite sport, and whether we can actually think of caring as something that is it realistic at all. But before that, I think when you talked about teaching coaches to care, I think then we come to these questions about, is caring a skill? I think those are some of the debates that have been going on when we think about kind of life skills and teaching life skills to young people through sport. And that's something I've been reading for my research at the moment. So can you teach them? Can you teach athletes to become a good person as if that's a skill that you learn? Or is it more about, being a certain kind of person that you cannot teach with any of the methods that we typically use if we talk about teaching?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think I've got the answer. And I think that one of the reasons why I don't have the answer is because so far in coaching, we've predominantly used Nodding's perspective. On care. There are other perspectives on care, and again, this is another area that we could do with more work. Stolt has done some work on virtue ethics approach to care, which might have more value. But so far, nobody's really picked up on that. We've kind of stuck with the Nodding's perspective, which sits well with the pedagogical view of care and the pedagogical view of coaching. So I understand why we've done that, but we do need to have alternative perspectives on care. From Nodding's perspective, I suspect, the argument would be is that we learn to care within relationships. So we've all got parents, older brothers, mentors. If I go back to my own coaching, I talked about actually looking back through my career. I've had a lot of female mentors. Even in my own place of work now, I work with some great female colleagues. And I wonder if I got an interest in care from them noticing something about me, investing energy and time, listening to me. I include Kathleen Armour, my PhD supervisor, on this. I include, as I said, Deirdre Hayes, who got me coaching in Newcastle, my old secondary school teacher who got me playing basketball, even my sister who spent some time introducing me to basketball, and I'm just wondering if we learn care through our existing relationships, and then if coaches take those skills, we learn what it means to be interdependent, to live in a wider world, and if we then take those experiences into their coaching. And if so, then maybe that's an opportunity for us to, look at how we can model that, how we can show care. And Nodding's work does talk about developing care through modeling. And it's a topic picked up from some researchers in the United States. Laurie Gano-Overway has picked up this work and done some stuff on caring climates. The idea, this has largely been done in schools, but the idea, if we have PE teachers, for instance, who model care to children who might have capital, so maybe the popular kids, maybe the most athletic kids, those children might then model care. And are those behaviors then picked up and observed? Is that care rewarded and valued and reinforced in schools, in clubs, so that actually we move beyond a single caring relationship between a coach and an athlete, And we might look at developing more of a caring climate or a caring club, where the care burden doesn't just fall on a coach or a sports psych, but it's shared with the physio, the S&C, the performance analysis. I mean, performance analysis is a really good example. You know, it's very much objective, quantified, statistical approach, but actually who's best placed to notice when an athlete is struggling? Is the performance analyst. So maybe they can do nurturing care. Maybe that's part of their role. And maybe that's something we need to model and show and teach, as well as statistical objective performance analysis. Lots of ideas there. Sorry, I'm throwing ideas at you left, right, and center, I think.
No, I think that's great. And I think that's what you're pointing out towards, a more like a culture of caring in that environment. And that would be something to strive towards. I guess with the kind of skills question, I just was thinking that, you know, at least caring is not a skill in the same way as psychological skills in sports psychology. So I'm not hoping to see a caring workshop in the same way as you know, goal setting workshop. So that would be something that in sports psychology could easily happen, you know. So probably we need to think about caring in a little bit different way.
Can I just follow up on that? That's because I think you'd be able to enlighten me on this, really. One thing I have been looking at is listening skills and motivational interviewing and empathetic listening. And are they skills that can lead to engrossment, for example, lead to noticing? And then maybe it's a disposition as to whether we serve those athletes' needs. So we might need caring skills to notice and understand our athletes, but maybe it's a disposition or a behavior to serve the needs. Because noticing isn't caring. So if I notice an athlete is struggling, that's the first step of caring, but it doesn't become caring until I do something and serve those needs, and until the athlete engages with a relationship and accepts, and we collaboratively do something. So yeah, I wonder if there is still a small place for a skills element.
I guess and we shouldn't say that it's either or. So I'm maybe being too critical, but it's easily in sports psychology, it would go towards, let's do a 1 hour workshop and then we have ticked the box, and now we can say that, you know, we have educated our people to care. So not saying that these things have no value at all, but that cannot, most likely that cannot be the only thing. And then you tick the box that we've done what is required of us.
And at the very least, again, I mean, you know, I'm a coach, not a sports psych, but when I look at sports psych, I look at Sophia Jowett's work, you know, which shows us that it's relationships. It's not one-off workshops. It's relationships. But I also look at, Duda's work on climates as well, you know. We know that it's relationships and context from a sports psych, and sociology shows this as well. You know, Robin Jones's work, Chris Cushion's work, sociology of coaching shows that it's coach, athlete, and parents, for instance. We're in relationships and climates rather than single one-off workshops. So hopefully, you know, we would go that way. You know, but I've probably given more questions than answers so far.
No, I think that's a good way to go. So hopefully somebody else will come back to us and say that they know the answers to all our questions.
And maybe the answer is in phenomenology. So to bring us back to where to start, we've just finished there talking about interpersonal relationships and contexts and climates. And that takes us back to kind of existentialism. You know, it takes us back to the life world. It takes us back to, we don't live on the earth as individuals, but as communities with others. How do we interact with others? You know, how do we educate athletes? Do we do that best in caring relationships? How do we educate them for the challenges that come? Do we care about the loneliness of the warm up in the athletic stadium, the 45 minutes? You know, do we care about the athlete and educate the athlete who's struggling at school? Do we work with the parent to do that? So it takes us back to those essences again, care, educating athletes for future challenges, and then working with others, to develop, even if that excellence is very different in very different life worlds,
Absolutely. But that also comes to for the existentialists, we are being in the world and being with others and always in this cultural context. And so I guess that comes to the question I threw out there a little while ago, that are we idealistic in terms of thinking about this caring relationship? And if we think of the world of elite sport, and there have been like so many crises and scandals about athlete abuse and mental health issues in elite athletes is like one of these very big topics in sports psychology at the moment. And there have been a lot of media scandals about like sport cultures and how they are destroying young people's futures. And so you've also done work on caring in elite and professional football settings. So maybe you can talk about that research, and also if we are being realistic with our thinking about caring coaching.
Yeah. Okay, so if I pick up on that research, so we did a paper around and we titled it "The Challenge to Care," and it was kind of it was a strength and conditioning coach's experience of working with an athlete in a professional football setting where performance has consequences in terms of relegation, and success brings more money to a club, but ultimately those wider economic influences, can either benefit a community. So, if a club is relegated and down to a lower division, they lose income. Well, that means staff have to go. And this is very, very topical at the moment. We are seeing this, as the world goes through kind of an economic shock, really, so there are consequences for communities. There's consequences for people in that world. So does a football club care about the wider community and care about winning, or does it care for an athlete who might need some extra time to recover from an injury? And that was the challenge within the paper. And even then within a given club, we also, as I said, it's an interpersonal world. We work with others. Well, how do the power dynamics work there? Do we care for our own position? Do we engage in micro-political activities? Do we undermine people? Does it become, a cutthroat, aggressive environment? So the strength and conditioning coach needs to navigate all of this to support the athlete. How do they navigate the internal power dynamics? How do they navigate the external economic influences? What about the athlete and their role? They want to get back and help a team for the greater good, for their own career. So it's a very complex relationship and system, and it's not easy. And I think our job then as researchers is to kind of problematize that, work with people to understand that, float solutions, work with people to see if they're out with solutions, and then to kind of come right round to your first question. Do the scandals that we've seen and the horrific incidents that we've seen, does that mean, that, sport can't be a caring climate and should we all give up and go home, basically? I'm more optimistic on that. And I think that's, that's probably reflected in my research. I haven't actually done much research on abuse. I've tried to look at research on caring relationships as a more positive vehicle, but it also reflects, probably my social perspective. Sport is a social construct. The economics around sport have been decided by individuals, so they can be reimagined, they can be redesigned. These aren't set in stone. And I think that reflects kind of a little bit of sociology there, but also some philosophy. I look at Maxine Green's work. I don't know if you've ever come across Maxine Green, but a philosopher from the States who talks of pedagogy of hope, building a better world through educating coaches, through educating athletes, modeling the worlds we need. And what I would say is, sport is very competitive. So if we can work with an organization to develop a caring climate, if that leads to better performance, that organization will get lots of attention, and that organization can model. Everybody in sport wants the next marginal gain. If that's a caring climate, people will look to that and will try to do that, So yeah, I think pedagogy gives us hope. I think Maxine Green shows that we can reimagine what our society is. Sociology shows us that we can deconstruct and reconstruct new institutions, new ways of working. It's not easy, but our job as researchers, I see, is to contribute to that. So I hope that's uplifting, because it's a rainy morning here in England. So I think we need some optimism.
What you said about, I think we all need some hope that, our work can make a positive difference, and the sport culture can also move towards a better tomorrow.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things I just wanted to briefly challenge is that throughout our discussion, you kind of shared the assumption that the caring environment is also going to be an environment that performs better. Is that always the case? Or can they actually be two separate ends?
Yeah, wow. It's a great question. And again, it's one we need to explore. I mean, I would go back to what does perform better mean? And this goes back to, I think, that paper on sustainability by John Dalston is perform better an individual who, is flourishing. They might be flourishing as an athlete. They might be flourishing in other parts of their life. So is that individual performing better then? So if we reconceive performing better as flourishing, I think that then gives us options to look at saying, okay, if we care for this person, where can we help them flourish? But don't forget, they also have to contribute. So a caring relationship is them working towards it as well.
Yeah.
And so I think if we go back to this idea of a caring relationship with them contributing, with us working with others within a wider climate, I think, more often than not, there's potential there for that person to flourish as an individual. If we want to strip it right down and say, are we going to win more games? I think that's, a different question. I think, unfortunately, you probably can win games very quickly by abusing athletes. But that is morally wrong. It's not sustainable. Ethically, we can't have that at all. And our sport needs to be much better than that. So our sport doesn't become sustainable unless we start caring for people. Our athletes don't become sustainable as athletes unless we care for them. Coaching isn't sustainable. So I think not only will caring potentially improve and help people to flourish from a performance perspective, but also morally it's the right thing to do. So I think it's where we need to be moving to.
It does answer, and I think we can, when we think of in a broader perspective, that what is a good life, and we hear from athlete stories that you might become the world champion, but it doesn't seem like you have lived a good life. So you have, for example, after retirement from sport, and we see the problems and that some athletes have after the career and also during their careers, and then we can think whether that was all worth it.
Was that good performance? It might have been in the very short term, in a very narrow sense of that person, but they might not be flourishing 10 years after their career, So we need to reconsider what is considered high performance and what is flourishing. I've met some successful athletes who don't like their sports. I've met swimmers who don't like swimming and they've got Olympic medals. And
that's a weird thing. I've talked to swimmers as well who it took them years to go back for the first time to do swimming after they stopped.
Yeah, and that's surely not success. If we have people who've spent years in their sport and they don't like it, then we haven't succeeded, have we? So we have to reconsider what is success. That's possibly idealistic. Yeah, let's not be naive. People are funded on 4-year cycles to win medals and things like that as well. So we need to maybe look at that and aspire for more than medals.
And I think let's finish up on a positive note that I think the both of us do believe that we can make a positive change or contribute towards a positive change. And I think your work on caring coaching is definitely striving towards that.
Absolutely. And I'm inspired, John Moores, we've got master's students on our coaching course. We've got undergraduate students. These are the people who are, going to be out there coaching. So we got an opportunity to challenge them, to develop this research, to share it with them. These are the coaches of the future. These are, the people who, can make their club a more caring environment, and there are lots of people out there doing good caring work as well. Often undervalued, often in the background, often not recognized by researchers if we only look at what they do on the field of play, but some of them are doing great work off the field of play. So, it's about capturing some of that good practice, sharing it, spreading it. It's exciting times.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed our talk. So thank you so much for the discussion.
No problem. I hope it's of interest to the listeners, and keep going with the podcast. I'm really enjoying it.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.